First, just a little bit about what plant diseases are. To hear a pathologist talk about a plant disease can be a little bit different than hearing a horticulturalist talk about a plant disease, but for my purposes, a disease is really anything that prevents a plant from reaching its maximum potential. So if you're looking at corn, your yield is going to be its maximum potential, but that's different for landscapes. You know, if you have that nice rose bush, well, now you're looking for those nice beautiful flowers on it, or if it's a tree, you want that good luscious growth with some nice shade. So really, we call disease anything that prevents the plant from reaching its maximum potential. So there are a few different components of the disease pathosystem, as we refer to it. We have the environment, a susceptible host, and a virulent pathogen. And the amount of disease development is really dependent on how much these three elements of our disease pathosystem overlap. And so when we have a situation like we have here, where there's no overlap between the environment, susceptible host, and virulent pathogen, in these situations, we tend to see very light, but more often than not, no disease occur.
Thanks, Kelly.
Compare that to this situation where now we're starting to get a fair amount of overlap of these three elements of the pathosystem. Now we're going to see a lot more disease occur. And hopefully, you guys will not be in a situation where you're seeing something like this, where we have almost complete overlap of the three components of our disease pathosystem. When a situation like that occurs, you're going to have pretty severe disease, and if there is anything to do, you know, the chemical options can help control these, but often when we have this sort of situation, you may just need to move the plant, or just kind of cut your losses and hope that next year goes better, unfortunately. So, again, like I had mentioned, the amount of disease development really is dependent on how much these systems all overlap. And that's how much disease we'll get. But the overall impact of that disease on the host, that's very dependent on when this overlap occurs in the plant or in the plant's lifespan. If it occurs early in the season, so say shortly after you've planted something, you have these seedlings come up, perfect storm where you have a lot of overlaps, maybe you have some damping off in the soil, along with a favorable environment for that disease. Well, those seedlings are probably just going to die before they've ever had a chance to do anything for you. Compare that to if it's maybe later in the season, if you're starting to see a little bit of rust develop on your turf at the end of the year, well, the turf's about to go dormant. It's already kind of ending its seasonal life cycle. You're not going to have that much of an overall impact on the host. So again, the later the later that this disease occurs on the host, generally for the better. And really, as far as disease development goes, with ornamental plant diseases, management is a very significant factor that can influence disease management, really because it influences all portions of that pathosystem, both the environment, the host, and the pathogen. So first, we'll just kind of break it down into the two main types of diseases that pathologists tend to think about. First are the abiotic diseases. These are caused by our non-living hosts. Sun scorch, nutrient deficiencies. If you have a drought issue, that would be an example of an abiotic disease. Compare that to our biotic diseases. So biotic diseases are our living diseases. Those are caused by a living agent, typically fungi, bacteria, or nematodes. However, we can consider a biotic disease to be anything that's caused by a living organism. Earlier I had a question about deer feeding on grass. That could be considered a biotic disease. So whenever we're looking at disease, it's always good to look at our symptom distribution at 3 levels. So we really like to start out broad and then focus things down. So first, always look at the whole landscape, then individual plants. And once you see where on the individual plants the disease is occurring, then we even recommend you look on the plant parts. Where on these plant parts are we seeing disease? So if you're looking at the landscape and you're starting to see disease or starting to see injury show up, where that's showing up can tell pathologists quite a bit about what might be going on. So if we have a situation like we have on this top picture, where we have a lot of injury that's occurring right on the border, generally that's going to be a sign of some sort of environmental issue. As you can see, we have injury all along those last, basically the outside plants all the way around. The environment right on those outside plants is going to be different than the ones on the inside. They're drying out a lot more quickly. Maybe they are a little bit more drought stressed. But that's what we tend to see for something that may be environmental. Compare that to this picture here on the bottom, where maybe you have one corner of the landscape, you're starting to see some disease come in, but it's slowly moving in from an area. This is pretty typical of an insect issue, as we're seeing the insects move through the landscape. This is also what we tend to expect if there is a sort of, if there's a virus issue, as a lot of viruses are vectored by insects. So as the insect moves through the landscape, they're able to move that virus through there as well. Other things that we would look for are something like this picture right down here. And these are lawnmower tracks on a lawn, but sometimes there can be stresses, or if there are extra stresses on a plant, they can become more susceptible to a lot of diseases. In this case, if you continue to mow in the same pattern time after time, you may have a little bit of soil compaction that's occurring right where those wheel tracks are going, and that could be what's causing the turf within the wheel tracks to be injured. Compare that to something like we have up here, where you're starting to just kind of see some random areas that are injured throughout the landscape. Over time, these areas are starting to progress, but they're not progressing very uniformly. They're not a perfect circle. They're not just only going in one direction, just kind of moving slowly out. That's pretty much what we tend to expect for your typical fungal disease, or nematode issues can be very similar to this as well. Big thing about symptom distribution is if it is a biotic disease, so one caused by a living agent, typically those are not very uniform. The environmental issues, those tend to be a lot more uniform across the landscape, but true disease caused by an abiotic or caused by a biotic factor often will look similar to what we're seeing right up there. So now focusing in a little bit onto where on the plant are we seeing these symptoms occur. Are they on the roots? Are we seeing them on the lower leaves? Are they up on the top part of the plant? Or this is a hops plant, or are we just seeing them on the reproductive portions of the plant? That can tell us a lot as well. A lot of pathogens are fairly selective about the parts of the plants that they will attack, and that can give us a really good idea what's really going on. And then finally, focusing down even more to the individual plant parts, where on those individual plant parts are we seeing the disease? Are we seeing just some marginal burning like we have right here? Are we seeing fairly uniform spots that are occurring throughout the leaf, all about the same size, but not really in a very set pattern? Compare that to over here, where yeah, we have some spots on the leaves, but they're all different sizes, and we really can't see any sort of pattern to those spots. Something like this, where we have a lot of spots that are all about the same size in a fairly uniform pattern. That's a pretty that's a good idea that it's not going to be a biotic disease. Chances are this is something abiotic. Likely herbicide drift can really cause issues like this. Again, most diseases do not cause uniform injury. So now as we're looking at this leaf right here, and just across the veins, we're starting to get a little bit of chlorosis or yellowing around the veins. That can tell us something. Or if we're looking over here, where we have a whole lot of different size holes in the leaf, that's typical of insect injury, especially as we see that these holes are they are not really able to cross the major veins. Again, the more information that we have is the easier we can make our disease diagnosis. So now we're just looking at the overall sizes of our common plant pathogens. So here we have your typical plant cell, pretty more or less a box, but then inside of this cell we have our four main types of plant pathogens. And so the smallest one that we have are the viruses, and here all that we have for those are just the virus particles that you can kind of see in the middle. Moving up, we have the bacteria. And then after that, we tend to get into the much larger plant pathogens, the multicellular plant pathogens. And those are our fungi and our nematodes. But, I really like to break things down into two different types of diseases as well. So yeah, we have our biotic diseases, but further breaking those down, I tend to think we can even say there's two main types. There are the cons and there are the thugs. And so when you think about a con man, he's someone who will deceive you. The goal is not to set off any alarms or any sort of security questions. And ideally, that con will continue to come back to you time after time, continuing to suck you dry. Compare that to a thug. Well, the thugs, they're just going to break and enter, could not care less if they set off an alarm. They're going to be out of there before the defenses can come. So the thugs, they just get what they want, and then they get out. Really, we can think about diseases as those same ways. And so we have our biotrophs. Those are the diseases that feed on living tissue. Typically, those are bacteria and viruses, although there are some fungi and nematodes that do as well. But our biotrophs typically can be thought of as cons. They're going to use the plant for what they want and hope that the plant won't ever know that they're in there. Compare that to our necrotrophs. Those are the ones that feed on dead or dying tissue. And often those are our fungi and nematodes. And so they're going to go and they'll kill the plant. They'll kill those individual cells. As soon as those cells are killed, the plant's immune system goes off and starts basically just starts a hormonal cascade that can cause a few different immune responses. But these thugs tend to not care about that. Again, they're going in, they're taking all the nutrients, and then they're out before the plant is able to do anything. So, starting with our cons, first of all, I'll discuss the viruses. So these, again, are our smallest plant pathogens. They are too small to be seen with the light microscope. Viruses are unable to enter the plants on their own. So a lot of the viruses that we work with, they have to be transmitted by something. Whether that's an insect, such as thrips or aphids, or if it's nematodes can help transmit viruses, there are some fungi that transmit viruses. However, within the landscape, one of the things that transmits most viruses are people and pruning. And so whenever if you're doing any cutting, make sure that you're disinfecting your tools between plants. If you have a virus issue in one of those plants and then you go and cut another one, you've now just spread this virus. And getting a little bit larger are our bacteria, and these are single-celled organisms. And again, similar to viruses, most bacteria are unable to infect a plant on their own. They need some other sort of opening in order to cause infection. And this opening can be caused by hail. It could be caused by some other sort of environmental factor, or it could even be if you are doing some pruning and it gets moist. There's a rain event. Well, that pruning, that you've opened up a wound site, and now this is where the bacteria can enter if need be. Bacteria tend to be favored by warm and humid conditions, and they can survive in soil and also in the plant debris as well. And as we get a little bit larger, kind of done talking about the cons, and now we'll discuss a few of the thug pathogens. First is fungi. And just a little bit about fungi terminology. The hyphae is the small thread-like filament that we have. And on the top picture, here we can see an individual hyphae that's growing along the root of some turf. Mycelia is going to be a mass of that hyphae. So kind of that, what looks like kind of cottony growth or a spider web sort of thing. That's your mycelia. And in the middle picture there, we can see the mycelia mat on the turf. Spores are really any of the reproductive structures that these fungi produce. Most fungi require free moisture on the leaves or on the plant in order to cause infection. And so a lot of times they'll need anywhere between 4 and 12 hours of continuous leaf wetness in order for these fungi to actually infect. So when it's really dry, or we have a really dry season, we tend not to see very many virus issues. And as with bacteria, these fungi can survive in infected plant debris, they can survive in the soil, they can survive, just period. And getting into our bigger thug are our nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic worm-like animals. A non-segmented roundworm is the technical term for it, but really just a really small worm. They can feed, primarily people think about nematodes feeding on the roots or underground portions of plants. That's often the case, but there are quite a few nematodes that can feed in foliar portions of plants as well. So you may see some of these issues a little bit further up the plant. Typically, if they are feeding on the lower parts of the plants or on the root tissue, if you look at those roots closely, you may start to see some deformation, whether it's galls or you may just see some lesions or brown areas where the nematodes have been feeding. And another one that we have is a phytoplasma. Phytoplasmas are you kind of think of them as a cross between viruses and bacteria. So they're not quite viruses, not quite bacteria, but they kind of behave like both of them do. Typically with phytoplasmas, though, the symptomology is pretty similar to a viral infection. And so you'll start to see the entire plant will show symptoms as opposed to just individual portions of it. And that can be stunting, chlorosis, or just an abnormal growth habit.